let me actually start by thanking John and also the Center for New American Security for putting the event on. And in particular, Shannon O'Reilly. I can't see you, Shannon. Where are you? Oh, hiding behind the pillar. Step out from the shade for a second. Hi. Shannon worked really hard to put this event together, and I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the efforts of the whole CNAS team. Dave's going to ask you some questions. I just got back from Colombia at 1 a.m. this morning, where I delivered possibly the worst counterinsurgency conference keynote address in history. The reason being, novel, Body of Lies, and took it with me on the plane, and I was reading the thing and thinking, oh, I've got to stop reading this novel so that I can write my remarks for the conference. But I just could not put it down. And I actually have it with me in my briefcase. I'm going to get you to sign it afterwards.
Not a problem.
Mumtaz.
I didn't pay him to say that, I promise you. This is a treat for me and I think for all of us. And I want to just jump into this by asking Dave to explain the title of his book, The Accidental Guerrilla. What's an accidental guerrilla?
An accidental guerrilla is one of about the 90% of the people that we've been fighting since 9/11 who are fighting us not because they hate the West or because they support the ideology of Al-Qaeda or one of the other Takfiri terrorist organizations, but rather because we just turned up in their village or their valley unilaterally with military force. We killed their cousin. We disturbed their livelihood. We did in some other way something that has alienated them and pushed them into the arms of local radicals who are now exploiting them and pointing them back at us. And I use a number of examples in the book, ranging from Iraq and Afghanistan, southern Thailand, Pakistan, even into the slums of Western Europe, to show that conservatively 90 to 95% of the people that we have ended up fighting since 9/11 are people that we probably did not need to fight. And just to sort of summarize this, the opening comment, Karl von Clausewitz, who we always quote in sessions like this, said, you know, the supreme and the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and the military commander have to make is rightly to understand the nature of the war in which they're engaging, not mistaking it for or trying to turn it into something that it's not. And the even greater philosopher Confucius said, the beginning of wisdom is to call things by their right name. And then, of course, the supreme philosopher Frank Zappa said, if you're fighting the world, put your money on the world. So the book is trying to understand what is the nature of the war that we're engaged on and try to, at least in the case of the Muslim world, stop fighting the Muslim world and the 98% that are not part of the problem.
I don't think Frank Zappa has a typology quite as elegant as yours, but you have in your book a description of a four-stage process that creates these accidental guerrillas that, as you said, didn't begin with a quarrel with the United States, didn't intend to be fighting us, but end up fighting us. So maybe you could, as we're just beginning to think about these ideas, explain that four-part process.
So, you know, the first chapter of the book is kind of dry, I have to warn you, and I look in a lot of detail at how you might seek to understand the current conflict environment. And I theorize that the accidental guerrilla, as I call them, emerge from a four-stage process. The first stage is infection, in which a pre-existing conflict, societal breakdown, a civil war, some kind of other problem is infected by a very, very small number of people from an external source, in this case Takfiri terrorists like Al-Qaeda, who will come in. They are not part of that society. They're not necessarily particularly popular in that society. Often they displace a pre-existing leadership group who are dispossessed and feel aggrieved at them, and they start to exert their influence burrowing into society. That's the infection stage. If that was all there was to it, it would just stay like that. But what then happens is the next stage, which I call contagion, is where the influence of that terrorist group, which is a very, very small numerical group, but has a substantial influence, often because of globalization pathways like world television, easy travel, transmission of funds from country to country, their influence spreads. Now, in the case of Al-Qaeda, we saw them establishing a presence in Pakistan and Afghanistan before 9/11, the infection phase. But we then saw this contagion effect where the violence and radicalization sponsored by that group spread around different parts of the world. The third stage is intervention, where Western powers intervene in that area to try and deal with the threat of groups like Al-Qaeda. When that happens, the entire dynamic shifts. And instead of being an outsider who's dispossessed the local leadership group and is seen with a certain amount of suspicion by the population, we turn up with large-scale military forces. Of the nature of things, we do a lot of damage, and we end up alienating the population and creating what sociologists call a primary group cohesion response, where people essentially bond to the closer rather than the more distant person, to the person that's more like them rather than the foreigner, and we end up in a rejection response where the whole of society ends up turning against us. It doesn't always happen, and I use a number of examples to suggest that. The first one, which is in the book, is Afghanistan, and that's a cycle that started with infection, followed by contagion, 9/11. We then intervened, and over a period of time, our rejection response has gradually developed in parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. In Iraq, which is the second example, we started it. We intervened. Then there was a rejection response from the population against our intervention, which created space for the infection of that resistance movement by extreme radicals who were not necessarily from there. And then in the final phase, there was contagion, where violence from Iraq bled out into a number of neighbouring countries and also further afield. So that's the other example, showing that it can start in numerous parts of the cycle. But then I talk about Pakistan, about southern Thailand, and about East Timor, and show how it doesn't just exist in those two big examples that we also talk about, but it exists in a variety of other conflicts, and it doesn't always have to be that way, and I show how you can do things differently. And then the final example in the book is Western Europe, and I show that it's not just the phenomenon of the developing world or remote hill tribes, but you can see some very, very similar responses in second and third generation immigrant communities in the West. And I suggest that for too long, Western governments have been looking at Muslim immigrant communities as like a fifth column or a source of threat. And that, in fact, that's exactly the wrong way to look at it. What they are is an at-risk population that's being targeted by an extremely small minority. And then at the end of the book, I go through a lot of detail about how we can do better. And using what my old boss used to call the passive exonerative voice. Since 9/11, mistakes were made. Okay? I hope we can do better moving forward.
We're going to talk tonight about a number of different adversaries and battlefields, but I want to start with the person who's still the leading adversary, at least in terms of the public consciousness, and that's Osama bin Laden. You have a haunting quotation in your book from bin Laden from 2004 that I want to read, and then ask you to talk a little bit about bin Laden's strategy as you see it. You quote him saying the following: "All we have to do is send 2 mujahideen to the furthest point east to raise a cloth on which is written Al-Qaeda in order to make the U.S. generals race there to cause America to suffer human, economic, and political losses without achieving anything for it of note. So we are continuing this policy of bleeding America to the point of bankruptcy. Allah willing, and nothing is too great for Allah." Is that, do you think, a summary of bin Laden's and Al-Qaeda's strategy today? And how do you think they're doing?
Well, I think that Al-Qaeda has evolved dramatically in its strategy since its foundation. The Combating Terror Center at West Point did a very detailed study called the Harmony Project, where they looked at internal Al-Qaeda discussion before 9/11, based on a trove of documents that were discovered in Afghanistan. And they were able to show that there was a very sharp internal debate inside Al-Qaeda, with some people arguing that the 9/11 attacks would provoke the United States into a series of actions that would alienate the Muslim world and create a mass uprising where Muslims around the world would rise up against local apostate regimes, throw them off and enable Al-Qaeda to act as the vanguard, the Al-Taliya al-Ummah, the vanguard of the world's Muslim population.